At 6:17 a.m., I was still the girl counting every penny for a cup of coffee. By the 18th minute, I had become someone with a private fund worth $27 million, a fund I didn't even know existed. But 93% of it was already gone, taken by someone I never expected. 4:45 a.m. The alarm went off with a familiar beep. I reached over to turn it off. The kitchen was half dark, the kettle switched on, and the smell of coffee drifted like a warm line through the cold air. On the wall hung a calendar with 3 boxes circled in pencil, rent loan groceries. I didn't think today would be any different. 6:17 a.m. The phone lit up with a cold, white square unknown number. I let it ring twice, then picked up. Avoiding calls used to be an old habit I no longer wanted to keep. A polite male's voice said, "Sorry to call so early. I'm Whitaker from the bank. There's an automatic regulation to protect account holders. When you turn 25, the system transfers management of your fund to you. The system just activated, but it detected something unusual." He added to make it clearer. "The system follows Eastern Time, so apologies for the early call. We sent a letter and an email last week, but it's possible the email ended up in your spam folder. On the day of the transfer, the system is required to call you directly." He went on to explain this fund was like money kept in a safe, locked until the day it could be opened. On my 25th birthday, the bank was allowed to contact me directly for the handover. I froze, gripping the handle of my mug. What fund? If you're talking about the tuition account that was paid off long ago. On the other end, I could hear the rustling of papers beginning to speak. Not tuition, ma'am. This is a private fund your grandparents left for you, held by the bank until you were old enough to receive it. Its value was about $27 million. When we prepared to transfer the account, we saw that over the past 3 years, regular withdrawals had been made totaling about 93% of the money. How could someone withdraw it? I asked, my throat dry. According to our records, there was a power of attorney, a document that allows someone to act on your behalf, signed when you were 22. The person who used that paper to withdraw the money was your father. The mug's handle gave a soft sound. A memory flickered across my mind one evening. My mother said, "The tuition money only lasts until your final year." I nodded and didn't ask more. Now the only question left rang clear like the ticking of a clock. I need to see all the records. "I've cleared my schedule until noon," he said. "Please come to our main branch. I'll prepare all statements and documents." The call ended, and the kitchen returned to its small, quiet sounds, dripping water, the clock ticking forward 1 notch. I rinsed the cup, dried it, and placed it upside down on the rack. 3 simple actions to steady my breathing. On a notepaper, I wrote 3 words: bank, records, lawyer, then wrote them again underneath like adding another layer of steel. I opened the closet, pulled out my dark coat, and slipped on my flats with worn-out heels. Hanging beside the door, the pendant my grandmother left me caught a thin ray of light. The rose soap scent still lingered on its chain. As a child, whenever the house was crowded and noisy, I used to slip behind my grandmother's coat. She would cup her hand over the back of my neck and whisper, "You don't have to be loud to be seen." Once she placed a small spoon in my hand and said, "What belongs to you, you serve yourself." I used to think she was just comforting a child. Now, those words shine through me like a thin mirror. I looked at the pendant for another second, then left it there. It wasn't time yet to wear something that weighed as much as memory. I tucked my sketchbook into my bag and locked the door. The sound of the lock clicked cleanly, like a neat period at the end of a sentence. The early city moved in its own calm way. A bus exhaled a thin stream of smoke. Office workers bowed their heads beneath a pale circle of sun wind. Slipping through my collar woke me up more than coffee ever could. The main branch lobby smelled of disinfectant and polished stone. The clock on the wall showed 7:23. A small steel sign read, "Customer service. Appointments only." A guard held the glass door open. I signed the guest log, my pen stroke straight and steady. The receptionist asked Miss Hartman, "Mr. Whittaker is waiting upstairs." I nodded. In front of me was a glass revolving door, the light slicing my shadow into 4 thin layers. I placed my hand on the railing, feeling the metal cold against my skin. This was not a time to argue or panic. It was time to reread the blueprint of my life like a building in decay, identify the cracks, remeasure the weight load, and find where to place the beams. I pushed the door and stepped inside. The small meeting room smelled of polished wood. The door closed behind me. Mr. Whittaker stood to shake my hand, a firm grip, just strong enough to make someone trust you for 10 minutes. He slid a neatly clipped stack of papers toward me. Copies of the transfers, the original fund paperwork, and one document placed separately. "I'll keep it brief and clear," he said. "This is the fund your grandparents set aside specifically for you. The bank held it until you were old enough to receive it. And this," he tapped the separate page, "is the power of attorney, a document that allows someone to act on your behalf, signed when you were 22. I looked at the edge of the paper and noticed a small smudge of ink in the corner, as if someone had hurried the pen. Suddenly, the room smelled like eggnog from an old Christmas night red tablecloth plates, set neatly, my mother pouring me a sweet creamy drink, and my father sliding a stack of papers into the spot where my plate should have been. Just a formality, he had said back then. I remembered signing my name as straight and clean as the technical drawings I used to do. Back in the present, I smoothed the edge of the paper and placed a plastic ruler beside it to line things up, an old work habit that helped steady my mind. Mr. Whittaker continued in an even tone. Over the past 3 years, the money was withdrawn in small batches totaling about 93%. The person using the power of attorney was your father. And just so you understand clearly, before you turned 25, the bank was required to list an adult custodian. Your family chose your father. He was informed of the fund's existence to complete the paperwork, but the full value and specific instructions were kept sealed in an envelope meant only for you once you reached the right age. After you signed the power of attorney at 22, he was able to make transactions as if he were you. He turned another page. The withdrawals were made in small enough amounts that they didn't trigger alerts to the beneficiary. Only when the account was about to change management to you did the system run a full check and flag the activity. We sent you a letter and an email last week, though they may have landed in your spam. Then he explained another practical detail. Before you turned 25, all contact and digital statements were directed to the custodian. Since you believed the tuition account was already closed, you didn't register to receive further updates. He flipped back to a marked page. The largest single withdrawal was around $800,000, the same week your sister got her acceptance letter to medical school and the whole family went to Europe. I've marked the date amount and notes here. He slid the paper closer to me. I didn't touch it. In my ears, the ticking clock suddenly sounded sharp like a thin blade. My hands grew cold against the edge of the table. I spoke slowly, clearly. So while I was eating instant noodles, they were having dinner in Paris. With my money. He nodded, saying nothing more. I folded and unfolded my fingers, testing whether the muscles in my hand still responded. Go on, I said. I want to see everything. If I had asked back then why those papers were sitting where my dinner plate should have been, I thought maybe I would have had a full meal that night. I didn't say that out loud. I only asked, do you have the original terms of the fund? He nodded and handed me a sheet. Written in my grandmother's words, this money was meant for her grandchild to choose. Freely, don't be afraid to choose wrong. Don't let anyone choose for you. The word freedom was pressed so hard into the page that the paper dipped into a fine groove. I folded the letter along its old crease and slipped it into the pocket over my heart, as if setting down a marker. What do I need to do now? I asked. Go through everything carefully, he said. I'll print out a list of each transfer, the date, the amount, the destination. And if you wish to file a complaint, we can provide the full documentation. The hard part is the family emotions. The paperwork is clear. I nodded. The family emotions I understood were the part with no printed forms. I separated the power of attorney paper, placed it into its own folder, and labelled it in pencil dinner. Beside it, I put a blank sheet of paper and wrote 3 short lines. Who put the papers where the plate should be? Who said it was just procedure? Who checked again after I signed, my handwriting tilted slightly to the right like someone walking quickly. Mr. Whitaker handed me his business card, saying I could call if I needed further explanation. I took it, though what I needed now was not the voice of the institution, but my own voice when standing before the people who once called my name to dinner only to hand me a pen. I gathered everything, neatly clipped it shut, and lifted the file. The weight of it was exactly like that of a full dinner plate. Before leaving the room, I looked at the polished wood of the table, imagining a white plate and shining silverware placed there. That dinner was still here, only this time I knew exactly what was on my plate. I opened the door. Light from the lobby slanted in the stone floor, cool beneath my shoes. In the elevator, I checked my reflection in the steel wall. Ordinary, neither furious nor exhausted, just sharpened. I sent a short message to myself. Never sign without reading again. Then I slipped the phone into my pocket, tightened my grip on the file, and prepared to drive to a house with a wall of photographs. The door opened, carrying the scent of polished wood mixed with a faint perfume. The hallway stretched along its walls, lined with framed pictures, like a timeline nailed into place. I set the file on a small table and opened my camera. Not to send to anyone, only to record the truth of what was here. In front of me was my grandmother's photo, her hair neatly tied back, standing before the sign that read, "Hail Fixtures and Supply." Beneath the photo was a small brass plate engraved "Founded, 1978, sold 2012. Next to it, another plate read, "Lake House, transferred to Richard and Margaret, 2012. I photographed each one clear enough to capture the words. I moved a few steps further to a row of newer frames. My graduation picture hung slightly crooked, as if it had grown used to giving way. At the centre was a photo of Claire in her white coat, with a commendation letter and a hospital badge mounted beneath it. I gently pulled Claire's frame, and behind it was a thin envelope, a Paris restaurant receipt dated the same week as the largest withdrawal in the statements I'd seen that morning. I photographed it, then slid it back exactly where it had been. Between 2 family portraits was another envelope car purchase papers. Next to my name was an old Toyota signed by my father. Next to Claire's name was a brand new car, with a note for safety while studying. The camera in my phone clicked quietly. Flashes of memory lit up my father's empty seat at my thesis defence, his place at the front row when Claire received her white coat, a summer when I worked an unpaid internship while the whole family took Claire to Honduras for a volunteer trip and called it a golden experience. I whispered softly as if to my grandmother, "You saw these things long before I did, didn't you?" I pulled out my keychain, the one with a small level containing a clear bubble of liquid. I set it on my frame, adjusted it until the bubble rested squarely between the 2 lines, then shifted the frame slightly inward by the thickness of a frame toward the centre. The hook gave a clean, small sound. Behind me, my father's voice came calm. "What are you doing here?" I kept my eyes on the level, straightening. He stepped half a pace closer and with 2 fingers pushed my frame back toward the edge the way he used to. He glanced at my phone. "Are you planning to photograph the whole wall?" "I'm recording the placement," I replied. I moved the frame back to the position I had measured, pressing the hook firmly. "This spot carries the weight better." "No arguments." He said nothing more, then walked into the kitchen. My mother's head appeared at the doorway. "Will you have lunch?" Her voice was as gentle as always. "I'm busy for a while," I answered. I gathered the photos into a new folder on my phone and named it Wall Evidence. Then I glanced down the hallway again. The wood was still warm, the light still golden. The story hanging on the wall hadn't changed, except that my frame now stood straight, catching a sliver of sunlight from the window. That was enough. I picked up the file, the phone resting in my palm. Somewhere nearby, the refrigerator door closed softly, and outside on the porch, a bird's wings beat the air. I turned, walking slowly down the hallway, counting the streaks of light on the tiles, as if they were markers along a path. No one reminded me to sit down and eat a second time. The doorknob was cool against my skin, the same feeling as that morning in the bank. The wall behind me did not move, only I had shifted my place upon it. I brought the file back to my apartment, drew the curtains to let the afternoon light pour in, set the kettle on, and placed the thick envelope on the table, as if laying down the first brick. I carefully slit the edge. The paper inside carried the faint scent of old ink. My grandmother's familiar slanted handwriting flowed into short sentences, clear enough not to need anyone else's explanation. She told of how she and my grandfather built a supply store called Hale Fixtures and Supply over decades. The year they sold it was 2012. A portion of the money was placed in the bank for the long term. She wrote, further briefly, the way she always spoke the lake house, and part of the investments were left to my parents. This part she underlined was set aside for me so that I could choose the path I wanted to take. She instructed the bank to keep it sealed until I turned 25, so that I myself would open the letter and decide. She wasn't afraid of anyone, she only feared the noise that could drown out the voice of the one who needed to speak. I set the letter down on the table, pressing my finger lightly against the spot where the ink was still faintly indented. The sunlight shifted a little, landing squarely on the word freedom she had written in bold strokes, as if pressing in another layer of trust. I kept reading. She said fairness did not always mean splitting things equally. Sometimes, to keep the table level, you had to gently pull in the chair of the one who always got pushed to the edge. I could see her bending down to adjust the old chair rail in the kitchen long ago. She wrote a separate line for my sister. The wool scarf she had knitted that winter was meant for Claire, along with a blessing to study in order to heal, and first of all to learn how to listen. I folded the letter's edge gently, though I did not close it. An old snapshot flickered in my mind. I was 10, and she pressed a small silver measuring tape into my hand, telling me, "Measure the table's side. Child, everything needs your own measurement." I pulled open the desk drawer. The tape was still there. Its spring snapped out with a soft click. I measured the edge of the letter as if it were a private game between us, then returned the tape to its place. I fastened my grandmother's necklace around my neck, my fingertips brushing across the smooth silver, locking it at the back. A familiar feeling, like the faint scent of rose soap, passed by. I photographed each page of the letter with my phone, making sure the images captured even the smudges of ink. I created a new folder, named it Grandmother's Letter, and sent it to Ava with a brief note the year the store was sold, the lake house, and investments given to my parents. This fund was mine alone, kept sealed until 25 for me to open. Fairness means restoring balance, not cutting things in half. I needed no further words. The images were enough. The phone buzzed softly to confirm it was sent. I poured hot water, sat still for 2 beats, letting my throat ease from dryness. From my apartment window, the late street stretched with streaks of fading sunlight. The sound of cars receded. I placed the letter back on the table and wrote a small note to stick on the file cover. Every decision must be made in my own handwriting. A sentence I had messaged myself that morning, now written down in blue ink. I folded the letter along its old crease and slid it into the inner pocket of my coat, right over my heart. That place was warmer than the rest of me. I looked once more at the necklace in the window's reflection. No miracle had happened. Only an old voice had been heard at the right time by the right person. The sharp sting of the morning had eased, giving way to something clear, something close to calm. I opened my phone, added another note for Ava: I will not choose silence. If the other side wants a settlement that keeps everyone quiet, they must first face what she wrote. I locked the screen, turned off the stove, slipped the phone into my pocket. As I stood, the sunlight shifted and rested once again on the word freedom, as if to remind me. I touched that inked word softly, then closed the door behind me. The next morning, I sat across from Ava Chen, in a room bright and even, like a freshly wiped table. On the desk lay the file, the photocopy of my grandmother's letter, and a slip of paper I had written the night before. Put the truth on the table first, then talk about money. Ava listened without interrupting. She spoke slowly, clearly, like teaching someone who had just slipped underwater how to breathe again. There are two paths, she said. Going to court means it will be public, long and exhausting, but the truth will be called by its right name under the lights. Settlement means it ends sooner, usually with a confidentiality agreement, meaning both sides promised not to tell this story in exchange for closing it. Ava looked directly at me. Your father isn't lacking assets. He withdrew the money, not because he needed it, but because he wanted to decide in your place. My phone buzzed, a new email from his lawyer. Ava opened it, skimmed, then summed it up in one sentence. They offer to return part of the money, admit no wrongdoing, and both sides must never bring this up again. I placed my grandmother's letter on the table, pointing to the two underlined lines. You may choose for yourself. Keep it sealed until you are 25, so that you, yourself, open and decide. I spoke slowly, so no one could pretend to mishear. I do not choose silence. If they want a settlement, there are 3 conditions. Return all the money withdrawn. Write a sentence admitting the wrongdoing, signed by the person who did it, and establish a scholarship named Eleanor Hale for struggling students, so that children always pushed to the edge of the table may have a proper seat. My phone lit up with my sister's name. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Claire's voice was small, as if standing on a staircase. If this comes out, the hospital will ask. I swear I knew nothing about the money. I leaned back deeper, my eyes still on the words, choose for yourself, in my grandmother's letter. Then, tell the truth, I said. You only need to say exactly what you know, no more, no less. There was a long silence on the other end. I'm afraid, she whispered. So am I replied. But fear is not a reason to hide. A soft breath crossed the line. I'll try, she said quietly. I closed the call and turned back to Ava. She lowered her pen to a blank page. I want to set a 48-hour deadline, I said. Not to bargain, but to give them a chance to choose how to tell the truth. Once it expires, we file. At the cafe downstairs, I sat with my back to the street and opened the photo folder. The brass plate, sold 2012. The brass plate, Lake House, transferred to Richard and Margaret. The Paris restaurant bill. The car invoice. I rewrote the note on the file cover more clearly. First state the truth. Money comes after. Return exactly what belongs to each part. The coffee cup leaned, leaving a brown streak on the rim of porcelain, like the line I had drawn beneath the word freedom in my grandmother's letter. That afternoon, I spread papers across the table. I printed the list of transactions, meaning the statement, with exact dates, amounts, destinations. I marked a small red dot on the Paris week. Then I wrote a 1-page summary. The funds came from the sale of my grandparents' store in 2012. The share my parents received was the Lake House and an investment portfolio. The sealed condition until 25. Before 25, a custodian was required and my family chose my father. At 22, I signed the paper allowing him to act in my place. Withdrawals were made over 3 years. My settlement proposal contained 3 clear points: full repayment admission of wrongdoing and the scholarship. I sent the 1-page document and the draft of the formal proposal to Ava, adding a single line. From now on, all communication goes through the lawyer. I titled it clearly, Settlement Proposal, Tied to the Truth. My phone buzzed to confirm it was sent. I placed my grandmother's letter over my chest inside my coat, fastened the necklace clasp at the back of my neck, and took a slow breath. This was not revenge. This was restoring balance. On the table remained only the aligned papers, the pen resting still, and the note rewritten into simpler words. I switched off the kitchen light, locked the door, and carried the file folder with me. Outside, dusk spread across the rooftops like a thin layer of paint, while inside my chest my breathing had evened out truth. First, the rest would find its place. I drove into Lakeshore Heights. As twilight settled over the low houses, porch lights glowing early like invitations to a gentle dinner, the door opened to the smell of garlic butter from pot roast napkins folded neatly. Silverware standing upright like chess pieces set in order. I pulled a chair to the long side of the table, no longer sitting at the edge. In front of me, I placed a thick envelope with bold letters. Conditions, 48-hour deadline. My mother poured a deep-coloured glass of wine. I pushed it aside and drew a glass of water closer. A thin, quiet spread like a freshly torn sheet of paper. My father sat across from me, glanced at the envelope, then held the knife in his hand as though keeping rhythm. He spoke slowly, his voice smooth like a tablecloth. I only arranged things for the family's future. Your sister needed a launch pad. His words made it sound as though money had simply found its rightful place. I opened the folder and laid out the 1-page summary I had written the 2012 sale of the store. The brass plate noting the lake house transferred to Richard and Margaret. The Paris receipt from the week of the largest withdrawal. The excerpt of my grandmother's letter with the word choose pressed deep. I placed each sheet in straight lines, tapping the fork lightly against each point, like a mason measuring tiles. This was the withdrawal date, this was the Paris night, this was the lake house given to you, and this was my grandmother's words. This part was for me to choose. I did not raise my voice. I spoke only loud enough that no one could pretend to mishear. Eat, child, my mother said, sliding a plate toward me. Her hand trembled slightly, sauce spilling onto the porcelain's edge before being wiped away with a white napkin. She brought the wine glass closer. Just a sip to warm you. I shook my head. I'll drink water. My father turned the knife handle in a slow circle, his eyes fixed on the envelope. Money matters are still family matters, he said. Don't make this bigger than it is. Your sister is about to start at the hospital, you know that. My phone buzzed lightly. The screen flashed a short notice. The banking system just blocked an old access request to the fund records. Request denied because management rights have changed. I set the phone face down, as before, looked directly at my father, and asked, in a voice as calm as asking the time, "Are you planning to try again?" He didn't answer. He only set the knife down. The sound of metal striking porcelain was drier than usual. I pulled the envelope of conditions to the centre of the table, set a 48-hour timer. The soft alarm muted screen face down. There are 3 conditions, I said slowly, as if laying bricks one by one. First, return the full amount that was withdrawn. Second, write 1 sentence admitting the wrongdoing, signed with the name of the person who did it. Third, establish a scholarship in the name of Eleanor Hale for struggling students so that those always pushed to the edge of the table may have a proper seat. I paused, letting the silent ticking of the phone's clock be felt, though unheard. When the deadline ends, I file. My father raised an eyebrow. You plan to drag private matters outside? I kept my eyes on him unflinching. I plan to bring the truth to light. The rest will find its place. There was the sound of keys against wood. Claire stood at the end of the table, laying her keychain beside the envelope. "I sold the car," she said softly but clearly. "I don't want to drive something bought with that money." My father turned toward her, his mouth parting, but she raised a hand to ask for silence. "If the hospital asks," she said, looking at me, "I'll tell them exactly what I know and what I don't." I nodded, saying exactly that is enough. My mother spooned more meat, the ladle slipping slightly, a piece hitting the rim of the plate with a soft sound. She set the ladle down, clenched her sauce-stained fingers in her palm, then wiped them slowly on her apron. The yellow light kept the room warm, but the warmth was only glaze on porcelain already cracked. My father lifted his glass, offering the usual toast. Raise a glass because we are still one family. My mother's wrist brushed the stem, spilling a red streak of wine across the table, bleeding into the transaction statement and touching the corner of the Paris receipt. I lifted the papers from the stain, flicked off the drops onto a plate, and placed them back exactly in line. The red streak dried, leaving a border like a scar. "There are stains you can't cover with red," I said, not blaming, not consoling. My father set the glass down slower than he had raised it, the wine's surface shifting like a restless eye. "I don't admit I did wrong," he said. "I did what was reasonable. Your sister needed it." I didn't argue the meaning of reasonable. I simply turned the Paris receipt so the date showed clearly aligned it with the withdrawal line, and slid my grandmother's letter excerpt half a finger's length upward. "Reasonable doesn't mean right," I said, and need does not stand above what belongs to someone else. My chair slid back slowly, the wooden floor sounding like a boundary redrawn. "If you and Mother want a settlement," I placed my hand on the envelope, "the conditions are here. If not, we meet where everything is called by its right name." I gathered my papers, leaving the kitchen to its garlic butter and the clink of spoons on porcelain. "Child," my mother began, her voice soft as an old sweater, but she stopped as if knowing some words cannot be rescued with hot food. Claire rose with me without asking permission, only nodding faintly as if making a promise to herself. My father gripped the knife handle tightly, then released it, both hands resting heavy on the table like objects, unsure of where they belonged. I touched my fingertip to the table's edge, the old varnish uneven, recalling the dinner years ago when papers slid into the place where my plate should have been. Now, at the centre of the table, there was no paper I signed unread, but the envelope I had brought in my handwriting under the deadline I had set. I glanced at the clock, the minute hand moved one notch. The 48 hours had begun. I held the file against me, the phone weighty enough in my palm to remind me that this time everything would move forward, in my own words. I passed the wall of photographs. My frame still stood straight, its edge catching a thin sliver of light like a thread. At the door, the night wind slipped into my collar cold enough to clear my head. I did not offer a wish for a good meal. The door closed behind me, with a clean sound like a period placed exactly where it belonged. I stood still for a beat. The hallway sensor light clicked off, then back on. Through the peephole, I saw a grey shoulder disappear around the corner, rubber-soled footsteps steady, as if someone was trying hard to keep calm. The elevator gave a short sound, and then silence. On the doormat sat a small cardboard box, tied with simple string. A single handwritten slanted E on the lid. The lid was still warm. I carried it in, pulled up a chair, cut the string. A faint smell of fresh paper rose. On top was a sun-creased instant photo of the two of us sisters, its edge curled from sunlight. My hand rested on Claire's shoulder in the yard of our old house, both of us smiling off-centre from the lens. Beneath the photo was her student ID card, the strap slightly worn. At the very bottom were the car sale receipt in Claire's name, a confirmation slip that she had deposited the down payment into her own account, the old keychain from the car keys, and a note I thought Mum and Dad had taken care of it like always. "I sold the car. I'm sorry." I set the note down and let it sit for a few beats to slow my heart. No call, no message. I opened my camera, photographed each item, time-stamped them, and created a folder on my phone named Box Evidence. With one tap, everything would line up in order. My phone buzzed. A bank message appeared. The system just blocked an attempt to view old records. Request denied because account management has changed. I locked the screen, my palm resting on the glass until my breath steadied again. I opened my email and drafted a message to Ava box left at my door, 4 items, enclosed photos, attached my sister, sold the car, supporting documents, included, please add to the file. Before I could hit send, there were 2 knocks on the door. The building security guard stood outside holding a clipboard. He spoke softly. The hallway camera recorded the person leaving the box at 9:07 p.m. If you want, I can save a copy and notify management. I nodded, thanked him, asked him to hold it for me, and gave him the email address for my lawyer to receive the file. The door closed, the hallway fell silent as before, but now the moment had a marker. I pressed send to Ava, then placed the items back into the box. The keychain rested in my palm, its thin scratches along the edge, telling of all the commutes, the shifts, the exams I had only heard of through Claire's hurried texts. I set it beside her student ID. The apology note I folded into thirds and tucked into the drawer where my grandmother's necklace lay. The rest of the documents I slid into a binder labelled Box Evidence, placing it next to the wall evidence binder I had prepared yesterday. 2 binders lying side by side, straight as parallel lines, pulling a house's axis back into alignment. I brewed a pot of tea, the kettle's whistle rising high, then falling soft. When I poured, the stream wavered at the edge for a second, before settling into the spout, the heat brushing my hand just enough to clear my head. I placed the photo of the 2 of us on the windowsill, tilting it so the streetlight touched its edge. No need to say more, the box had spoken. A short image flickered in my mind. A skills exam room. The examiner asked Claire, if the source of your tuition money was in question, what would you do? She took a deep breath and answered, I would tell the truth, and if necessary, I would pause receiving support until I could explain. That scene existed only in my imagination, but I believed it. Because the box was here, the papers were here, the keys were here. I returned to the table, reopened the email I had already sent, renamed the photos for easier search, and added a line for Ava. The hallway camera recorded at 9:07 p.m. I asked security to save a copy. Please work with building management to receive the file. My phone buzzed. Ava's reply was short. Received added to the file. If needed, Claire can confirm the matter of the car. I wrote back, I will not contact directly. Everything goes through you. I cleared the empty box, untied the string, smoothed it flat, and put it into the recycling bag. The room felt tidy again. I picked up my pen and wrote one line in my notebook. The best apology is correct action, and forgiveness requires time and a clear boundary. I didn't send that sentence to anyone. I just kept it in my notes, like putting a small stone into my pocket to touch when needed. I sat quietly for a few minutes, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, the distant sound of cars, then looked at the 2 binders. I was grateful to my sister for stepping out of the family's safety zone, but I still held my own boundary. Tonight, I would not save anyone with soft words, would not close the matter with a touching phone call. I would only put everything in its right place, evidence into binders, photos into folders, emails to the lawyer, camera footage preserved, the door locked. The clock at my parents' house was still ticking. The 48 hours had already shed a few marks. I touched my grandmother's necklace, the cool silver surface smoothing my thoughts. I wondered if the person who left the box had looked back through the peephole the way I just had, if they stood waiting for the elevator with a hurried breath. Whoever it was, I understood sometimes people can only apologize by setting something down and walking away. And whether the receiver turns that offering into the next step depends on the boundary inside their own heart. I stood, pulled the curtains to dim, the light switched off most lamps, leaving only one warm glow where the two binders lay side by side. The Polaroid photo on the windowsill held a narrow streak of light straight enough to steady me. I sipped the tea, bitter, then sweet, simple, yet clear. The night needed no more dialogue. Only the knowledge that from here on, all communication would go through the lawyer, all feelings through action, and all decisions in my own handwriting. The next morning, I taped a note to my door with one sentence: I only work through my lawyer. Here is her email. In my mailbox, I set an auto-reply with the same message. On my phone, I switched to receive calls only from Ava, and the firm leaving the rest on the silent vibration. Just as I slipped on my shoes, the doorbell rang twice. The mailman stood at the porch with a thick envelope red stamp marked "Urgent," the top corner, printed with my father's law firm's name. "Please sign," he said. I read the first line, set the pen on the table by the door, and spoke slowly to steady my voice. "I do not accept documents at home. Please forward them to my lawyer's email." He nodded, withdrew the envelope, made a note on his clipboard. The door closed, and in my mind, the clock ticked forward another notch. On the way to the elevator, my phone buzzed unknown number. I answered. My father's voice was steady and firm. "You are hurting the family." I held the phone close so my own voice stood firm. "Thank you, Dad. From now on, everything goes through my lawyer." I hung up, logged the time in my notes, and forwarded a line to Ava to file. Downstairs, buying coffee, someone flashed a press badge. "We only need one line to confirm no recording." I gripped the paper cup with both hands. "I have no comment. Please contact my lawyer." The reporter stepped half a pace closer. "Just 10 seconds?" I shook my head, repeated the same line, then turned to security. "Please, help me keep order." The glass door closed, and my reflection looked a little calmer. On the sidewalk, another unknown number rang, introducing himself as a family friend voice, warm, suggesting, "Settle quietly because everyone is tired." I answered briefly, "Please send all thoughts to my lawyer," then blocked the number and logged the time. At the office, I set my phone face down beside the keyboard and opened the unfinished drawing. A message from my mother appeared like a light tap on glass. "The house is always open for you." I didn't reply. I only forwarded it to Ava, pinning another marker. Near noon, another unknown call came, a polite male voice, asking to verify a trust from my mother's side of the family. I repeated the line I had rehearsed, hung up, put on my headphones, and pulled myself back onto the flat plane of work. My phone buzzed softly, a message from Claire, short and steady, like a measured breath. Before an exam tomorrow, the training office would ask, and she would tell the truth. I replied, "Stay calm. Just say what you know." Then took a screenshot and saved it into the evidence folder. Sometimes a promise needs to stand beside documents. In the afternoon, my phone alerted a voicemail. I listened in an empty meeting room. Speaker pressed to my ear, my father's voice lower. "Now, don't do something you'll regret. I can take care of it." I noted 1426, sent the file to Ava, and wrote one line in my notebook. "No one takes care of something with money that was stolen." Leaving the meeting room, I stepped onto the small balcony, took a long breath, drank half a bottle of water, then returned to my drawing. Minutes later, Ava's email appeared. "They request an urgent meeting within 2 hours. Hold to your principles. I will attend." I set a 90-minute timer, reviewed the photo folders, and files, once more fastened my cuff button that had come loose, as a reminder that all I needed was to stand straight and repeat one line, leaving the rest for the papers to speak. By day's end, an administrative female voice called to confirm my mailing address for documents. I read Ava's email telling me not to receive anything directly at home. Almost at the same time, she wrote, "Again, I've replied to them, just keep the rules steady." Back at my apartment, I printed another sheet of paper and taped it to the inside of the door. "I do not receive documents directly. Please send through my lawyer." I posted another copy beside my desk so I wouldn't soften when tired. I set my phone to silence all unknown numbers until the 48 hours expired, leaving only vibration when Ava called. In the few minutes while the kettle boiled, I drafted a quick email. In the morning my father called, I refused. In the lobby a reporter approached, I refused. On the street, a family friend suggested settling quietly, I refused. At noon, a trust verification call came, I refused. In the afternoon, my father's voicemail I forwarded. At the end of the day, a request for my address, I only gave your email. I closed the letter with a firm line. Until the deadline ends, I will not answer directly on any channel except through you. I lifted the kettle, pouring slowly so the water wouldn't spill the steam, clearing my head. A message from Claire appeared. I signed up for an extra weekend shift to keep my mind from wandering. I replied, "Work helps you stay upright. Remember to eat, don't drink coffee too late." I saved the screen and closed all apps. The room was still. I placed my phone face down beside my grandmother's letter, the desk lamp falling exactly on the word freedom she had written in heavy ink. I touched it lightly like fastening a button. The watch in my pocket clicked forward another mark. I walked around, checking the windows, switched off the extra lights, leaving only the desk lamp shining on the two binders lying side by side. No words were needed tonight. The most important sentence was already taped to the door, set in the mailbox, and ready on my tongue. I opened my notebook and wrote one line to read again tomorrow and still find true: never let anyone else tell your story. Then I closed it, leaned back, listening to the fridge shift and the kettle, cooling, small sounds, marking a day that had passed without arguments, only boundaries set with calm words and precise motions. I switched off the lamp, letting the hallway light fall across the floor like a thin, white chalk line, telling myself that tomorrow I would repeat this exact routine until the clock struck 0. This morning, the clock struck exactly 0 as I stood in the courthouse hallway, holding two binders tight against me, shoulders straight. Ava handed me a freshly sharpened pencil and whispered, "You only need to read it right." My father arrived with his lawyer, his steps neither hurried nor slow. Claire followed half a step behind, and as she passed me, she paused for a very brief moment and gave a small nod. The courtroom door opened. Inside was a long wooden table, 2 water pitchers, white lights above. The judge looked over his glasses and spoke plainly. "Today we review documents, here briefly make a temporary ruling. No long arguments." I sat upright and placed both binders on the table, the wall binder with the brass plate engraved. Sold, 2012, the photo of the Lake House deed, transferred to Richard and Margaret. The Paris receipt and the list of withdrawals. The box binder with Claire's car sale receipt, her student ID, the photo of the box left at my door. Ava spoke in less than 90 seconds. She slid the one-page summary to the centre of the table. The funds came from the sale of the grandparents' store in 2012. My parents' share was the lake house and an investment portfolio. My fund was sealed until I turned 25 for me alone to open and decide. Over 3 years, withdrawals aligned with the Paris week. The settlement proposal had only 3 clear terms: full repayment and admission of wrongdoing, signed by the person who did it, and the establishment of a scholarship in the name of Eleanor Hale for struggling students. Ava placed the Paris receipt beside the withdrawal entry of the same date the sold 2012 brass plate beside my grandmother's letter. Next to them, she set the printed call log times and short notes I refused and redirected to my lawyer. I opened my grandmother's letter to the page with 2 underlined sentences from the night before, and with the pencil I underlined them again thinly. "This part is for you to choose. Keep it sealed until you turn 25, so you, yourself, open and decide." My father's lawyer spoke in a voice seasoned by courtrooms. This was a reasonable arrangement for the family's future. No one was left behind. The younger daughter needed a launch pad. The father only did what was necessary. He slid a blank sheet of paper toward me, its header printed with 3 words: shared story. I turned the paper, once set my pencil tip on its edge, then pushed it back. I will not sign a story missing the truth. The pencil tapped the table with the faintest sound, just enough for me to hear myself choosing where I stood. The judge flipped through my grandmother's letter, lingering on the word choose, then spoke not loud, but clear. I read a different meaning here. This is the right to choose of the one who was meant to receive. He looked up. Today, I review, documents, ask a few questions, then make a temporary decision. Ava requested permission for Claire to speak. The glass in front of her circled softly on the table before settling as she laid her hand down. She lifted her head. I did not know the source of the money. I sold the car. I am ready to tell the truth. I felt my shoulders lighten by half a weight. The judge nodded, recorded it, then turned to my father. Did you fully inform your daughter when you withdrew the funds? My father lowered his eyes to his hands, answered vaguely. I thought it was for the good of the whole family. The judge cut in. The question is yes or no. He repeated, yes or no. A third time, his voice no louder, but heavier. The only sound in the room was the clerk's pen, pausing a beat, then writing again. I pressed my fingertip to the binder's edge, holding it still. The silence stood upright between two glasses of water. The judge closed the file and delivered his temporary conclusion, as neatly as fastening a latch. The remaining funds must be frozen immediately, meaning no one may touch them. My father's side must submit a detailed record of all withdrawals within 14 days, specifying dates, amounts, and destinations. Both parties may meet to discuss a settlement, but any settlement must align with the truth just placed on the table and the 3 conditions already stated. The next session was scheduled in 21 days. The red seal struck the paper with a dry thud. I felt the binder under my hand grow lighter by another half weight. No one clapped. Only the recording machine clicked to a stop. Ava thanked the court, gathered the documents, and placed my grandmother's letter between the 2 binders, like a spine holding the file together. We stepped into the hallway. White lights, the vending machine, humming, a few people tapping their phones. The world outside unchanged, but I knew a ridgeline had shifted. My father's lawyer approached, voice lowered. We will consider reimbursement. Ava replied immediately. We wait for it in writing. Without a signature, it is as if nothing was said. Claire stood 1 arm's length from me. She bit her lip, then released it, nodding faintly. I did not look into my father's eyes. I looked at the cool chain around my neck and the 2 binders resting steady in my hands. On the courthouse steps, sunlight poured down like a blank sheet of paper. Ava texted me the next appointment, along with one question. Are your principles still intact? I answered with one word, intact. Then added, the scholarship in my grandmother's name is not decoration. It is the necessary part to restore balance. I opened the folder on my phone, scrolling past the 2 short names that now carried an entire story, wall, and box. The wall of photographs had spoken through brass plates and receipts. The box at my door had spoken through invoices and an apology note, and today my grandmother's 2 sentences had spoken the rest. As the car stopped at the curb, I thought of the nights I had redrawn my life like a failing floor plan, identifying cracks, measuring load, setting beams. Today, one beam had been placed not by shouting, but by papers laid in straight lines. At home, I set the 2 binders on the shelf, opened my grandmother's letter once more, underlined the word choose lightly with the pencil, then slipped the letter into the inner pocket of my coat close to my heart. I brewed tea and sat in silence. Outside, the day narrowed a thin streak of light, stretching across the floor like a ruler. I aligned the edge of the binder with that streak as if making a final check before leaving the workshop. No declarations were needed. Only the continuation of the right tasks await the 14-day record prepare the scholarship charter hold to the 3 conditions keep my back straight. I locked the door, whispered to myself. The 2 words, restore balance like a password. Only I could hear, then turned off the light. The next morning, the kitchen table became my desk. On the left edge, I taped a calendar with 14 boxes on the right. I set the printer and teapot, and in the middle lay the stack of papers Ava had sent at 8:12. I spread the account statement out like a strip marker, in hand, circling the parts that stood out. The Paris week matched a large withdrawal. The new car item was plain, and there were lines marked educational support with no school name or invoice attached. At the top of the page, I wrote 4 clear questions so anyone could see who, when, how much, and where. Then I went line by line. Around the 7th line, I saw an unfamiliar account name listed as Family Education Support. The name sounded like a tuition fund, but the destination account was not a school's. Next to it was a small transfer that later looped back into the family's household expense card the following month. I boxed it in, Red took screenshots and sent them to Ava, with a short note request their side to provide the true recipient's name and the true purpose. The moment I pressed send, my phone buzzed. The bank notified me the system had just blocked an attempt to add an additional contact to the file. They wrote that any change would require a code sent to my phone, meaning no one could slip in. I enabled 2-factor lock, so any access would now need a second verification code. I captured the notice and sent it to Ava with one line I've added another lock. I pushed my chair back slightly to see the whole layout like an engineer checking a site plan. The flow of money on the paper looked like a branching canal. My task was to point out which branches truly watered education and which ones flowed straight into the family's yard. I divided the sheet into 3 clear columns. The first column, real educational support, with class names and receipts. The second column, family expenses unrelated to education. The third column, vague items that needed clarification. For each line, I stuck a yellow note with a single sentence, so that reading it tomorrow would still show clearly no supporting document, or not a school account, or coincides with Paris Week. The doorbell rang twice. I opened a crack. The mailman handed me a thick envelope, top corner, printed with my father's law firm's name, the outside labelled Good Faith Proposal. I read the first line it suggested, creating a scholarship, but made no mention of admitting wrongdoing. I signed the refusal line and wrote directly on the receipt I only work through my lawyer and only accept documents with an admission of wrongdoing and repayment. The door closed. Back at the table, I drew the 3 conditions thickly at the page's margin, like red guardrails at the cliff's edge so no one could pretend confusion. Ava called on video. She circled 3 lines in the statement and said gently but firmly, "These 3 items must have recipient documentation within 24 hours. I set a timer on my phone and added a sticky note to the binder cover, 24 hours for the truth. I sent Ava a new 1-page summary distilled into 5 points. The year the store was sold. My parents' share was the lake house and an investment portfolio. The condition that it remained sealed until I turned 25. The transfers over 3 years overlapping with the Paris week. And the 3 vague items each with clear questions. I wanted anyone who held the page to see exactly where the money had gone. Near noon, the university's foundation office called back, asking me to state in a single short sentence what I wanted the commitment to be. I read slowly. Each year, bring 1 person from the edge of the table to the table and make every expense public. The line went silent for a moment. Then the officer said they agreed in principle and asked me to send a draft the same day. I opened a new file, named it Eleanor Hale Scholarship, and began writing as if it were an emergency exit guide anyone could follow. Objective: each year, bring 1 person from the edge of the table to the table. Eligibility students from disadvantaged backgrounds with priority for first-generation college students. Fields of study, environmental design and healthcare, so that both my sisters and my story would be present there. Criteria: passing grades. A letter of no more than 500 words, telling their real situation, no need for perfection, only persistence. Process selection by an independent university committee. My family would not participate, and the list of recipients would be public. Scope of support: tuition books and basic housing, absolutely no luxury gifts. Oversight: a one-page annual report released publicly. At the end of the file, I left a line to be engraved on a plaque with my grandmother's words. Fairness is not always dividing equally. Sometimes it means restoring balance for the one always pushed to the edge of the table. When I finished, I opened my sketchbook and drew a simple chair I planned to place in the university library. The backrest curved slightly, for comfort the seat broad so the person sitting wouldn't have to shrink the legs slender but firm. Beneath the drawing, I wrote a seat at the table in the name of Eleanor Hale. Looking at the chair on paper, I remembered my grandmother once said, "People only sit steady when the chair does not wobble." I photographed the sketch and attached it to the draft sent to the foundation office, along with the scholarship charter and a short letter explaining why the fund was created. I sent another email to Ava requesting that the scholarship charter be inserted verbatim into the settlement conditions. I printed 2 copies, sealed them in envelopes marked "Scholarship Documents for Record." That afternoon, the supplemental statement arrived. Some of the educational support items now included real school invoices, but the family education support account still had no named recipient. I highlighted it in yellow and wrote by hand, "No documentation. Without it, treat as household expense." My phone lit with a message from Claire. The hospital asked, and I answered, "I didn't know the source of the money. I sold the car. I am ready to tell the truth." She added a screenshot showing the entire car sale amount transferred into the university account for dormitory and books, with the purpose clearly stated. I saved the image into the evidence folder and wrote one line for myself. She chose the lighted side. I crossed out day 5 on the calendar. The rhythm of time shifted from steady to firm. By day 7, the foundation office officially responded. They accepted the scholarship charter and scheduled a short call to finalise how it would be announced. On the call, I clarified, "The chair is not decoration, it is memory turned into a real seat." The officer replied, "We understand." I printed the charter and placed it between the 2 binders, the title facing outward like a signpost. By about day 10, Ava sent me the revised account statement. The items with school documents went into the column of real education. The items without documents stayed in the uncertain column. As for the family education support account, Ava had already requested the recipient's name within the deadline. I added a red label reading 24 hours beside it and set a soft chime to ring a few times a day so I would not let it slip. That evening, I opened my coat closet, slid a copy of my grandmother's letter into the inner pocket, then placed the sketch of the chair beside it. The 2 sheets touched with a sound like 2 pieces of wood locking into place. I walked the room once, arranging everything neatly. On the left was the wall file for the past. In the centre was the box file for the present. On the right was the scholarship file for the future. Everything in its place. On the 12th day, I sent Ava an updated 1-page summary, highlighting the 3 uncertain items, in bold and reminding her of the 24-hour deadline for proof of the recipient. She replied that she had sent the request formally, and advised me to keep my voice steady if anyone called. I muted all unknown numbers, leaving only Ava or the foundation office to reach me with a soft vibration. Before bed, I looked at the calendar. 2 blank squares remained, with a note on day 14 final response due. I reopened my grandmother's letter and reread the 2 lines I had underlined. "This part is for you to choose. Keep it sealed until you are 25, for you alone to open and decide." I folded the letter and slipped it back into the inside pocket of my coat near my heart. On the table's edge, the scholarship charter lay between the 2 binders like a beam newly set across a house frame. The sketch of the chair leaned against the wall, glowing softly under the desk lamp. I turned the light off and thought of tomorrow. One last review, waiting for the answer about the family education support account, holding firm to the 3 conditions, ready to read the scholarship charter aloud in front of both sides if they would sign. No need for many words. The documents would speak for me. I entered the meeting room with 2 binders tucked under my arm, a long table water glasses, the wall clock ticking evenly. Ava sat to my right. Across from her were my parents and their lawyer. Claire sat at the far end, hands neatly folded. I placed the wall binder on the left, the box binder on the right, and slid the scholarship charter, bearing my grandmother's name, into the centre for everyone to see. Ava opened in exactly 1 minute. The 3 conditions remained unchanged. Repay every dollar withdrawn. Admit wrongdoing under the correct name. Establish the scholarship according to this charter, public and transparent. Without a signature, nothing counts as said. The reminder in my pocket buzzed softly. The whole room paused, half a beat. I silenced it and spoke steadily. The clock for the unclear funds has begun to run. I laid the papers along a timeline. The Paris receipt, beside the withdrawal on the same date, the brass plate of the store's sale year beside my grandmother's letter, open to the page with the 2 lines she wrote for me. The call log printed with hours noting my refusals, and that everything was redirected through my lawyer. Claire's car sale receipt, beside the photo of the box at my door. Ava slid forward the page with the 3 ambiguous transfers I had circled in red. All 3 led to an account that sounded like a scholarship fund, but did not belong to the school. I pointed to each line, speaking slowly so my voice would not shake. This is not a school account. One amount even looped back into the family's expense card. We require documents proving who received it and for what purpose, within 24 hours. I pressed the timer. My father leaned back, saying it was all for the family's future, that my sister needed a launch pad. His lawyer proposed replacing admit wrongdoing with regret. Ava shook her head. Regret is not an admission. Ava's phone vibrated. She read 1 line and looked up. The university confirmed that the account named Family Education Support is not part of their system. The room settled, as if everyone had just heard a faint crack. I made it clearer. That means, in addition to recipient documents, we require the stated purpose of use. Claire spoke up. She had not received a single dollar from that account. Here was the screenshot of transferring all car sale money into the university's housing and books account. She was ready to put it in writing. Ava placed a 1-sentence confirmation sheet in front of her. Claire signed the strokes firm and slid the paper to the centre of the table. I nodded to her that was enough. I took out the small envelope I had prepared. Inside was a short statement. With a space for a signature, I withdrew funds from the trust in my daughter's name, against the intent of its founder. I admit I was wrong and will repay in full. The opposing lawyer tried to change against the founder's intent into not improper procedure. I kept my eyes on him, my voice steady. Not improper procedure is blurred speech. Here it was done against what she had written. It needs to be called by its name. Ava read out the 3 core points of the scholarship charter. Each year, bring 1 person from the edge of the table to a proper seat. The recipients are struggling students with priority for first-generation college students, in fields tied to architecture and healthcare. The process is managed independently by the university, with a public list covering tuition books and basic housing, no extravagant gifts. I added 1 sentence. The chair in the library is not a decoration. It is a public promise that there will be a rightful seat for the one once pushed to the edge. My father's lawyer returned to the matter of the signature. He looked at my father as if asking for a nod. My father did not sign immediately. He asked for time to deliver a signed copy within the day. Ava replied we would wait until 5 o'clock this afternoon. After that, if there was no signature, we would return to court with every document presented today. Ava's phone rang. The court clerk confirmed the calendar was already reserved for Monday morning room 3, in case no signature appeared by 5 today. Ava said, "Thank you," ended the call and turned to me. "The slot is secured." I nodded. We closed the remaining markers. Within 24 hours, they must submit proof for the 3 ambiguous transfers. Within 7 days, the remaining funds must be moved into an escrow account, as agreed, then dispersed according to the scholarship charter and repayment. The draft settlement would be finalised within the day, with the charter attached in full. I gathered the 2 binders, clamped the charter between them, feeling lighter, as if a beam had been set properly in place. At the door, my father's lawyer said, "We will resolve this internally." I answered evenly, "Internal does not stand above truth. Paper is the only conclusion." Claire stepped half a pace closer, said nothing, but nodded lightly. I nodded back. I left the meeting room with the phone in my pocket, counting down. 24 hours for the documents, 7 days for the money to reach its rightful place, and 1 signature that must stand beside the truth. Out in the hall, a breeze cooled my wrist. I exhaled a long breath. Not because I had won, but because at last everything had been called by its right name. On the morning of the deadline, the alarm on my phone buzzed softly. Ava pulled up a chair beside me and opened her email. 2 of the vague items came with full documents recipients clearly named. The last one they could not prove, so it was added into the sum to be repaid. I marked a check beside each line, the feeling like laying the final brick of a wall built through long days. At noon, Ava forwarded the signed admission of fault. The wording remained exactly as we required, with no clause of silence. My father's blue ink signature lay neatly beneath it. I said nothing, only smoothed the edge of the page, as I always do before any drawing. By afternoon, the bank reported the remaining funds had been transferred into the escrow account. Ava messaged the court clerk to file the settlement that same day. At the counter, no gavel was struck, yet the room carried the weight of a blow that had already sounded elsewhere. The clerk cleared the reserved date, giving back an empty square of light. In the hallway, my father said, "Take care of your health." I replied, "Thank you for signing and repaying." That was enough. Claire hugged me quickly, saying she would come to the announcement. The next day, the library opened earlier than usual. The fund officer placed the scholarship charter on the wooden podium, Eleanor Hale written at the top. The chair bearing her name stood at the entrance, the wood still carrying the faint scent of oil paint. The university representative spoke briefly, reminding everyone that all expenses would be made public yearly, so all could see where the money went. Ava stood at my right, steady as a line. When my turn came, I drew from my pocket the photocopy of my grandmother's letter, folded in 4. I read the 2 sentences she had left for me alone, then read the line of my own that I had lived through before, speaking aloud each year, "Bring 1 person from the edge of the table to the table." I mentioned no names, letting the papers, the signature and the chair speak for themselves. The first recipient stepped forward. A freshman wrist marked by the strap of a cheap watch, clutching the envelope of interview invitation. I leaned aside to make space. He sat down, shoulders dropping half an inch, his breath slowing. I stood by, placing my hand on the back of the chair, as if on someone's shoulder, not pushing, only steadying. The small plaque at the chair's base, engraved with her words, caught a thin sunbeam, the letters rising sharper. In that moment, I remembered the kitchen at the very start of this story. The calendar with 3 squares marked the faint scent of coffee. The phone alarm that split my life into before and after. Now the wall stood straight, the beam had been set, and the chair had someone sitting. After the ceremony, Claire came to me. She said she would keep answering truthfully whatever she was asked. I told her to keep her studies steady, to eat and sleep enough with nothing to prove beyond the truth. She nodded, her eyes brighter. I did not seek my parents in the crowd. If they stood somewhere, they would see the chair and the plaque. That was enough. The fund officer handed me a thin envelope, a hurried thank you letter from the group of students who would join the selection, promising to record every expense clearly. I smiled, remembering my kitchen table with 3 columns of papers and the yellow notes. From now on, what I once did alone would be done by a whole group in the light. I stepped back to look again at the library entrance. People moved about, pulling chairs, opening books, the soft scrape of chair legs across the floor, like a note of music. I reached up to touch the necklace my grandmother had left. The cool metal drew me back into steady rhythm. I thought of the children who would walk in here, hearts racing, eyes searching for a place so they would not have to stand by the doorway forever. They did not need to know my story. They only needed a chair bearing the name of a woman long gone and a line of words reminding them to sit upright. On my way out, Ava sent a screenshot. The first part of the money from escrow had been transferred into the fund according to the charter, the rest to be released by schedule. The repayment column on the tracking sheet now showed a full round number. Ava wrote one line. "This part is done. The rest is to live true to what is written." I replied, "True." I laid my palm on the edge of the chair one last time. Smooth and cool like the kitchen table my grandmother used to wipe slowly each afternoon. I whispered only for myself, "I have sat, now I yield." Then I turned away, and the late-day sky was not very blue, but bright enough to see the path. In my pocket was the thin letter, at the library door was the chair bearing her name, and within me was a house just set back into balance, no longer creaking. If I had to name this moment, I would call it the setting right of balance.